Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Freedman alongside Jonathan Penta of Penta Wealth Management. Jonathan, always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Our next guest up is Joe Feehan, partner of Blum Shapiro. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we know a lot about your firm, and a wonderful firm that's expanded tremendously around the area. And your focus in particular is on all things Massachusetts from a tax perspective?
That's right. So I've state and local tax generally, but with a focus on Massachusetts. So again, I'm the Massachusetts state specialist, but I do all things state and local tax across the country.
So interesting, because I think most people don't think much about anything other than general sales tax on goods and services. Are there other taxes that exist from a local level in Massachusetts?
There are. There is the sales and use tax. Massachusetts for companies has a corporate tax, but also a piece of it that's measured by income, but also measured by net worth. For people who operate in a flow-through structure, the S corporations, we have what they call the sting tax, which is an entity-level tax on the flow-through S corporation, and it is basically meant to get you back to what the personal income tax rate was. So it kind of scales down, and you have to have a certain number of sales before it applies. But that's always a fun conversation when you have a company that said, "Oh, we have to pay that," and then if you have a group of businesses, you measure it based on the group's kind of revenue. So it is a bit complicated, but we have to think of all that, and we have some other things we're going to talk about. There's the new paid family and medical leave. And people have probably seen in the news there's the expansion of the short-term renters tax.
Yes. So let's touch on the paid family and medical leave law, because I know that's October 1st, right?
Correct.
It just came into existence.
It did.
One of those ones that was, I think, promoted for some time, but probably didn't get a lot of attention from people until it actually came into play.
That's right.
So where did that come from? And am I right in saying Massachusetts is one of the first, if not the first in the nation to have it?
It's likely one of the first. We are seeing, this is trending. We are seeing other states kind of enact this. And really the policy behind the law is that we would have companies provide paid family or medical leave. So they define, medical as, taking care of, an aging parent or a sick child. And then there's the family leave piece. So the law is basically it's going to be funded through a payroll tax that's in two parts. Part of it's going to pay for the family leave, and part of it's going to pay for the medical leave. It's split between the employee and the employer. And there's an extra component for large employers, which the state defines as over 25 employees.
Hardly a tremendous threshold. I'm sure many people at the 25 and 30 mark feel like they're not large employers.
They certainly would. It is interesting too. If you're self-employed, you're not subject to the tax, but there is an option to buy in. And it may surprise you, but we've actually had some people say, "Well, hey, I'm self-employed. Can I actually pay into this and get it?" And there is a mechanism to allow that.
So in the event that you are self-employed, and this probably applies to a lot of entrepreneurs who, may have a corporate entity, whether it be a closely held entity, an LLC or an S corp, but they would not be subject to their own payroll would not be subject to the tax. Correct?
That is correct, unless they're, say, if you have an S corporation and then you're an employee of the S corporation and a shareholder. I think the thing to think about is if you get a W-2, you're
Right.
likely going to be subject to this tax. So if you're a member in a limited liability company and you get a K-1,
You wouldn't be subject.
you would
to the
not be
tax.
subject to it. But you can be an employee of a company you're also a shareholder for. So you might be in a situation. Think of like your S corp, where the shareholder is also the CEO and takes a salary. That person would be a covered employee.
So let's touch on that for a moment, because it's fascinating. So if you happen to be a member of an LLC getting a K-1, you're not subject to tax. Does that also mean you're not eligible to collect?
Correct.
Okay.
Although there is the opt-in,
Okay.
and people are asking about the opt-in. For people out there who are faced with this, if you use an outside third-party payroll provider like an ADP or a Paychex, we will say they're on top of this. So they have mechanisms to adjust through withholding. One thing that is interesting that Massachusetts did, there are a lot of startup companies that they don't give you a W-2. Everybody gets a 1099. There's a mechanism in this law that if 50% of your workforce or greater gets a 1099, you have to withhold on them. And that was something that the third-party payroll providers were trying to figure out how to do. And I think they have their arms around it. So really the questions we get at Blum Shapiro are, hey, are we a covered employee? And that's what the third-party payroll providers are. Paychex isn't telling their clients you're a covered employee or not. They're saying make the determination and tell us who to withhold on. So we're getting a lot of those questions, and that's what we can kind of help folks out there in the marketplace with.
So was this one of those things that rolled out relatively quickly, or is that just perception that it happened quicker because it seemed to sneak up quickly relative to a lot of other things?
I think it's been in the works for a while, and then as you get closer to the date, I know they were going to start it in July, and they pushed it back. So then all of a sudden, it's here, and everyone's, we have to figure out how to withhold. So people are working with the payroll providers. We started getting a lot of calls. I got calls internally from Blum because we're subject to the tax. So people are, well, what happens? And again, it's a tax that's passed through to the employee. So people are going to see a little bit less in their paychecks. Right. And I think there's a period before you can claim this. The eligibility point's a little ways out. They have to kind of fill the fund first.
Okay. And are there thresholds that people reach in terms of paying into the fund? Above do you pay up to a certain limit of payroll, or is it indefinite? You pay
That escapes me right now. I know the law does address that. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I
Okay.
think there may be a cap, but
similar to Social Security, right? It caps
similar
at
to
some
Social
point.
Security.
Right.
Social Security caps and it raises each year. There's no cap on Medicare taxes.
Okay. So another area that might apply to people, and obviously has been closely watched, is the short-term rental tax.
That's right.
That's so people using third-party platforms, Airbnb, HomeAway, those types of things. Historically, we're not remitting any sales tax, correct? Or we're not collecting sales tax.
They were not collecting and remitting the tax. So really this goes back a ways. So you have really the Airbnb or the VRBO platform to either rent a room in your house, rent an entire apartment. The hotel industry has long said, hey, this isn't fair, right? We're paying these occupancy taxes, we're paying these rental taxes, and you guys aren't. It's not a fair playing field. More recently, with kind of the housing shortage in Boston and rising rents and housing costs, what Airbnb has the effect of doing is taking long-term rentals off the market. So that was a lot of the legislators said, hey, this is a way to address housing costs as well, because you have an apartment that would normally rent out. Now it's a short-term rental. So again, it's kind of twofold, and really it's viewed as one, leveling the playing field between what is, essentially some of these units are really operating as short-term hotels, putting on the same level as the traditional bed and breakfast or a hotel. And then what, really more remember, there's a state law that we're talking about here, but also cities and towns also have laws. So Boston has a law, which again, really the aim is to kind of say, let's get some of these properties back on the rental market. I think the term was something that they think maybe 3,000 units might come back on the long-term rental market as a result of the registration and these platforms not being able to list certain properties. So that's sort of the broader policy behind that.
So it makes sense from that perspective. I guess where it has direct impact is on, I don't know, grandma who has an extra room that wants to rent it out, and now she's faced with the complexity of collecting tax and remitting tax.
And she is, and there was a lot of talk over, well, who has to register, and really the registration requirements are very broad. It may be that she has to register. Maybe she's not the one collecting the tax. Maybe that's on the platform, but she's still got to go down and register. There is a 14-day limit, so if the Airbnb argument might be like, well, hey, this is a long-term city resident and property taxes are out of control, so she needs to rent the room to kind of cover, to stay in the house. That's the kind of the industry argument. There is an exemption if you're only going to rent out the room, say less than 14 days per year. You would not be subject to the tax, but there is still a registration and an exemption process. You have to document it.
It's interesting, though, because, one cannot always forecast. I know, having had some experience on those platforms, you put your property out there and you may or may not rent more than 14 days a year.
That's right.
So is it retroactive or is it prospective in terms of it makes it a little challenging for the
I think it's a little challenging. I think if you're going to claim the exemption, you have to claim it. And then again, if you go on a kind of a hot streak and you rent out the apartment, you're going to be subject to the tax and you're going to be subject to it for the entire period for all the rentals.
And probably interest and penalties on that.
Yes. Well, interest and penalties are always the rub. When we have to bring a client bad news, say, hey, you should have been paying this tax all along. Sometimes the interest and penalties, that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah.
We can help, not so much for the short-term rental tax, but for other tax types. Generally, if you find out you should have been paying, you might be well advised to kind of approach the state. At least in that case, you can get penalties waived through what they generally call like a voluntary disclosure agreement. Okay. Almost every state offers something like that, including Massachusetts.
So always better to let them know for yourself rather than them tell you.
It's better to come forward and ask for forgiveness than for them to find you and kind of run you through the ringer.
Got it. So what are you seeing as some of your small business clients' largest challenges? Obviously, getting through the payroll withholding piece, and again, if they have third-party payroll processors, that's a little more simplified. But
yep.
Again, we're in an environment where people are feeling like tax is taking a bigger and bigger bite out of every paycheck.
Yep.
Where I guess where do you see the impact, and is it likely? It's easy to say, well, it's 0.1% or it's 0.6%, but these things add up. Especially
they
with things like healthcare being out of control. It's like people say, well, what's left at the end of the day?
Yep. Well, I think really, the issue here is, for your small businesses, if we look to the paid family and medical leave, there is a piece it's a cost of the business that you can't push it to your employees. So it's more than just kind of a compliance exercise. And again, this is a 0.75% tax, but to your point, there's, a whole slew of other taxes we put on, and, local businesses also are subject to tax on tangible property. The car tax is another thing that individuals will gripe about in Massachusetts. But yeah, no, to your point, it all does add up. It's not only the rate and what you kind of can push through to maybe your employees or your customers, but there's also the compliance of all of this, right? Sure. It's additional forms, registrations, additional man hours you have to kind of put towards this. Yep. So again, the cost of compliance is a big thing, and that's not coming down.
So I guess, one of the questions I have relative to you guiding and advising your clients is, are you saying to them, go back and reassess your cost of goods sold because, you've got these additional taxes that you've got to factor into your selling price, and if you're going to stay at the same profitability or maintain, the levels that you've had, you're going to have to reevaluate what you're selling at.
Yeah, that's a good point. We had, everyone knows the local company. They're based here in Boston, Wayfair, and we're about a year and a half out from a big Supreme Court case where Wayfair was held to, even if you're not in the state, you have to collect sales tax. So what we have is a lot of our clients are finding that hey, they've been selling into all these states. They're not even sending reps there. Just having sales there and having a certain number of transactions adds to the cost. So this would be something, it's an additional cost to your customer. You have to charge sales tax to them now where maybe you weren't before. But it's also having to have people in the company, do these registrations, fill out these forms, try to understand what the local law is, right? On sales tax, generally, if you sell a product, it's going to be taxable unless it's to an exempt party or there's a specific exemption. Services, that's a whole other ball of wax, right? Well, services are generally exempt unless enumerated. But again, what you get into things like software. Well, what are we selling?
Right.
We're not even delivering anything. Is it a service? So really, it's I think being proactive on this is the best thing. But at a certain point, I guess with the sales tax thing and the Wayfair decision is kind of everybody's hit, right? And everybody has to kind of push on. It was Amazon in the early days that said, well, hey, we don't want to be in any of these states, but as they've grown, they're everywhere. So they were kind of on the other side. Well, no, Wayfair, you should pay sales tax too. And that's really where it ended up. So really, there's a very small threshold for small businesses that are shipping outside of Massachusetts. A couple numbers to keep in mind, $100,000 of sales or 200 unique transactions in an individual state, you're going to need to file a sales tax return. And I don't think a lot of people are thinking about that. So if you haven't been thinking about it and you've missed the boat, you can approach some of these states and ask for a voluntary disclosure. But I will tell you, a lot of states are now sending out notices to people saying, hey, we see your sales in our state. Where's our return? When they find you, you're going to pay those penalties.
Wow.
Yeah.
So again, great advice. Be proactive. If you're, again, thresholds that you mentioned, if you're up against those thresholds, then give you a call
Yes, give us a call.
and make that work.
If you're running a business, the other thing where taxes don't always get thought of is if you're looking to buy or sell a business. Everybody's very focused on quality of earnings and everything like that, and tax can sometimes be an afterthought. But generally, we'll get a call and, hey, we've structured a deal like this, and they're saying it's tax free, and I could say no,
Not quite.
not
Yeah.
quite.
Right.
But talk to us in the beginning.
Excellent. Our guest on Radio Entrepreneurs has been Joe Feehan, partner of Blum Shapiro. It's been a pleasure. If people want to get in touch with you, Joe, what's the best way for them to reach you?
I think we have a great website, blumshapiro.com. There's we have great backgrounds on our managers up through partners. You can find the person who could help you the best and the office closest to you.
Excellent. Thank you for coming on Radio Entrepreneurs. Our guest again has been Joe Feehan, partner of Blum Shapiro, alongside Jonathan Penta of Penta Wealth Management.
Thanks
Been
for
a
having me,
pleasure.
John.
And we'll be right back with another guest on Radio Entrepreneurs.